In fact, there's a purpose to that, which hopefully you'll understand at the end of my remarks. Hanukkah, as you know, and as you've seen in detail in this conference, is an interesting holiday. It celebrates a miraculous historical event, beyond just the miracle of oil, which is a legend found in rabbinic literature, Masechet Shabbat. A 1 day's oil supply of oil lasting 8 days is a miracle. But that pales beside the remarkable, I would say miraculous, in the sense of divinely guided and sanctioned series of military victories by a relatively small Jewish army against the vast military and economic resources of the Seleucid Empire. These victories resulted eventually in the establishment of a more or less independent Jewish state, as you've just heard, also a somewhat miraculous event. In a war beginning with featuring famous heroes like Yehuda Maccabee, and acts of heroism like Eleazar and the Elephant, which is a tale of martyrdom among other tales of martyrdom in the Hasmonean wars. But unlike the oil miracle, the sources for the historical narrative of heroism and triumph, that is the central facts, the names and places that are used in everything from grade school stories of Yehuda Maccabee with the kids, girding their loins with swords and shields, to rabbis' sermons in shuls, to Al Hanisim, which we say in our daily prayers during the days of Hanukkah. All the facts for all this are not in classical or traditional Jewish sources. There's nothing obviously in canonized biblical books or in rabbinic literature, but this information is contained in books not found on the traditional Jewish bookshelf. And I'm referring, of course, to the 2 books of the Maccabees 1 and 2, and also Josephus, who was based more or less, but not entirely, on the books of the Maccabees. The First Maccabees was originally written in biblical Hebrew by someone either in the Hasmonean court or close to the Hasmoneans, written maybe 35, 40 years after the original uprising by Metityahu, the Hasmonean patriarch. It is narrative history written in biblical form, mostly military and politics, which takes the story down to Shimon, the death of Shimon, the Hasmonean, one of the 5 Hasmonean brothers, in 135 BCE. It is bears very strong similarities to Shmuel or Melachim, or actually Megillat Esther. Note the first sentence. This is actually a back translation into Hebrew because all that survives is the Greek translation. But the first sentence of First Maccabees is Vayhi achrei hakot Alexander, which sounds very much like the beginning of Megillat Esther, Vayhi b'yemei Achashverosh. The intention of this book was, of course, to be the official record of the Hasmonean wars, the Hasmonean rebellion, and to encourage. It was written also to encourage all Jews to celebrate Hanukkah. To that end, that is encouraging Jews around the world to celebrate Hanukkah, it was translated into Greek for the widely dispersed Greek-speaking Jewish communities. There probably were more Jews speaking Greek then than Hebrew. And only the Greek survives, probably because it was used much more than the Hebrew was. But it is often possible to reverse engineer the Hebrew, as I've just demonstrated with the first sentence of First Maccabees. Second Maccabees was written in Greek, not in Eretz-Israel, but in North Africa. What we have purports to be the abbreviation of a 5-volume account of the wars by someone named Jason of Cyrene, about whom we know nothing other than that he purportedly wrote 5 volumes on the Maccabean revolt. The book, as we have it, covers the rebellion and glorious career of Yehuda Maccabee down to his death. He's the real center of attention in Second Maccabees. And this is an account laden with theological explanations of almost everything, particularly the astounding successes, one after the other, of small Jewish forces defeating huge Greek armies. Its purpose seems to be to prove that the Hasmoneans were successful because of God's plan, because of God's blessing and actually active help. There are some episodes when God intervenes physically to bring about the desired result. And it was also written to encourage the celebration of Hanukkah on the 25th of Kislev, and also a holiday no longer celebrated by Jews called Yom Nikanor, the Nikanor's Day, on the 13th of Adar. This was a great, purportedly miraculous victory over the Syrian Greek general Nikanor. And in antiquity, it was celebrated on the 13th of Adar, Yom Nikanor. There were actually several holidays observed by Jews in antiquity that are not observed today. There were others you can read about, some of them in Megillat Ta'anit. I recommend the fabulous edition and commentary by Vered Noam. Also, some Jewish holidays no longer celebrated are mentioned in Jewish inscriptions from the time. Hanukkah became a non-localized national Jewish holiday through the concerted efforts by the Hasmoneans and possibly also by Herod. Again, I recommend there's a brilliant article written by Moshe Benovitz, which claims convincingly, I think, that Herod was very active in making Hanukkah a national holiday, actually in rededication of his temple, but nonetheless, it was possibly partly through Herod's efforts that it became a national holiday for all Jews. Of course, it helped that Hanukkah was localized in Eretz-ישראל, centered on a temple, and also occurred around, it was a festival of lights occurring around winter solstice when other cultures were celebrating the renewal of the light. The rabbis related to it and sanctioned it, probably after the fact. They probably sanctioned a holiday that also had already had become popular among Jews. But even after Hanukkah became a shared holiday across Judaism, the whole narrative explaining what we're celebrating was never accompanied by a canonical text. There was never the equivalent of a Megillat Esther. There was something called Megillat Antiochus, which is a much later sort of forgery purporting to be an account from the time. So we have a kind of a funny oral tradition based on actual books that Jews, even well-educated Jews, don't normally read. That is the First and Second Maccabees, and then Josephus's account of the events as well. When you actually open these books and read them, you find that the Hasmonean rebellion was many wars at once. And when I say wars in the plural, I mean it was, of course, a rebellion against the Seleucid Empire, in the end successful. But it was also several conflicts simultaneously within the Jewish population. Now, this is obviously something that we don't celebrate or mention in our celebrations. Hanukkah is remembered as binary. Just read Al Anisim. It's a tale of successful heroic resistance to an evil foreign enemy who, together with its Jewish supporters, but evil Jewish supporters, wished to wipe out Judaism and replace it with Hellenistic cults and culture. So there are two camps. There are good guys and bad guys, to be crude about it. But in fact, even from the sources themselves, it wasn't a binary struggle between good and bad, holy and unholy, law-abiding and lawless, but it was a many-sided conflict within a complex and layered society. And why wouldn't you think that Jewish society was complex and layered and contentious within itself? Something quite familiar to us, perhaps. Now, the first conflict within the society was a power struggle at the top. That is, there were families, aristocratic families among the Jewish leadership who were fighting over who will be high priest. And this internal conflict was in fact recognized already in antiquity. Josephus, for example, he begins the account of the Jewish rebellion, his account of the Jewish rebellion against the Romans. He opens with the following sentence. Here I quote Josephus. There was a stasis, he writes in Greek. There was an internal conflict among the Jewish ruling class at the time when Antiochus Epiphanes was disputing territory with Ptolemy VI. So in other words, he puts it in the context of an international conflict between two great empires, Antiochus in Syria, Ptolemy in Egypt, and the Jews were between. There were rival claims among the Jews to supreme power, as no individual of rank could tolerate subjection to his peers. So he accounts how one of the rivals, Onias, went to Ptolemy and sort of a war broke out. So he thinks the whole Maccabean revolt started with a with basically a struggle at the top, who's going to be high priest. That's how it started, according to Josephus. And indeed, the books of the Maccabees provide oblique but clear evidence for the struggle between different claimants to be high priest. We read about machinations of the sons of various families, names like Menelaus, Jason, Alcimus, Onias, I just mentioned, who was supported by the Egyptian king. And these are high-ranking Jewish families who tried to use world powers of the time, the kings of Syria and Egypt, for their personal benefit, even bribing or paying large sums of money for the purpose. We know of two of these Jewish rivals for the high priesthood who went to Antiochus and paid him a lot of money to support him, or to the Seleucid king. And by the way, this really includes the Hasmoneans. Yonatan, who became high priest, was particularly adroit in manipulating rivalries within the Seleucid court for his own advantage. And in the end, he was rewarded by a Seleucid king, Yonatan the Hasmonean, with coveted titles like friend to the king, which was a great honor. In which he sought the backing of the Seleucid king as well. He was able to exploit rivalries there. So the Jewish upper classes exploited or used to their own advantage international politics in order to, in their own struggles against each other. And really the bottom line that is the self-elevation of the Hasmoneans to the high priesthood, which meant the replacement of an old ruling class with a new one. Both the old and the new were eventually backed by the Seleucid Empire. As Lawrence Schiffman, a professor at Yeshiva University, wrote, effectively, the Maccabean revolt can be understood as a revolution of one Jewish group against another, and ultimately the replacement of one ruling class by another. That's one aspect, just one aspect of the internal conflict, which was the Maccabean revolt. And let me point out, before I go on to what I think is more interesting, that calling in a big foreign power for your local advantage is classic behavior in civil war. That is, especially for a small area or population like the Jews under the rule or shadow of a large empire. That is, soliciting the help of somebody who was previously your other, your enemy, to fight your newly defined enemy who's your brother, is classic behavior in civil war. But I find it more interesting to me than the struggle at the top was the apparently pervasive critique and strong differences and even opposition to the Hasmoneans by different groups or sectors within the Jewish population, somewhat lower down in society's ranks. The Hasmoneans were not at all universally admired or supported in their own time or afterwards. And I don't mean just the Hellenizers, who are the traditional and Jewish enemy, identified with the Syrian or Greek enemy in both books of the Maccabees. The most prominent and mysterious of these other groups were called the Asidaioi in Greek, which is clearly a transliteration of Hasidim in Hebrew. So the Hasidim called themselves Hasidim, describing their own piety. They were a separate group. Sometimes they allied with Matityahu and his sons. Sometimes they opposed them. They even briefly backed a rival high priest named Alcimus, who was backed by a Syrian general named Bacchides. So the Hasidim were independent. They were self-declared and governed by their practice of piety. Now, they weren't in armed conflict with the Hasmoneans, but they were often opposed to them. Who they were, what they believed, whether they were the forerunners of later sects or groups like the Pharisees or the Essenes, these are topics of, believe me, intense controversy and contention among scholars. But the reason we don't know more about them for certain is that the authors of the books of the Maccabees, our only sources for them, don't bother to tell us, because they were interested only in whether the Hasidim were for or against the Hasmoneans. So the Hasidim were a doctrine-driven group with a very uneasy relationship, sometimes for, sometimes against the Hasmoneans. As one scholar named Jonathan Goldstein wrote, the Hasidim surely thought that Matityahu's teachings were impious and his actions heinous sins. They probably called him man of violence, doomed to destruction. This could be. But the reason we can't say so for sure, is that the Hasmonean advocates, that is the authors of our sources, suppressed this information about them. The author of the First Maccabees, as Goldstein writes, is most unwilling to concede that a clear-seeing, pious Jew could oppose his heroes, the Hasmonean heroes, and the same thing goes for the Second Maccabees. Another group, not even given a name, but numbering 1,000 people, including wives, children, and cattle, are described in First Maccabees as, quote, seeking justice and vindication by withdrawing to the desert. In other words, demonstrably not participating in the revolt. In the desert, they were massacred by the Greek army because they refused to fight on Shabbat. Their martyrdom is said to have inspired Mitityahu to fight on Shabbat. This was clearly an issue which was contentious among Jews of the time, whether or not to fight on Shabbat, and not everyone followed the Hasmoneans' interpretation. And then I could recount also other schisms. For example, the sect that established itself at Qumran around this time, a little bit after the Maccabean revolt. They identify their main enemy in some of their psharim as a wicked priest, who is often or usually identified with Yonatan or Shimon, two of the sons of Mitityahu, and so forth. Obviously, there are also the Hellenizers, the traditional opponents of the Maccabees, but they were not an organized group, but a stream within Judaism who believed that Jews suffered more harm by opposing the dominant Greek culture than by accommodating it. So what we have is an incomplete picture, but its outlines are clear. Different groups and streams within Judaism opposed or had an uneasy relationship with the Hasmoneans. On the one end of these opponents, we have the Jewish Hellenizers, who argued that it was dangerous to oppose the dominant culture, and Judaism could accommodate a blending. That was unsuccessful. And on the other, we have the pietists, for whom the Hasmoneans were not pious enough. So as Lawrence Schiffman, again, a professor at Yeshiva University, wrote in a very honest article, quote, in effect, we have to face the reality that these great struggles, generally assumed to be part of the heroic history of the Jewish people, were to a great extent inner Jewish struggles. And it shouldn't be forgotten that the Hasmonean revolt involved massacres of large numbers of Jews by Jews. This is said openly, even triumphantly, in both books of the Maccabees. For example, in First Maccabees, we read, as the Hasmoneans gained strength, quote, they smote sinners in their anger. This is Jews. So they smote sinners in their anger and lawless men in their wrath, so that the survivors fled to the Gentiles for their lives. And also in First Maccabees, we read that wicked Israelites fled to Antiochus, complaining that our own countrymen have become our enemies. Indeed, they have killed as many of us as they could find and have been plundering our property. Now, on the other side, Jason, one of the contenders for the high priesthood, also was accused in Second Maccabees of mercilessly perpetrating massacres of his fellow citizens. Now, interestingly, the author of Second Maccabees says about Jason's massacres of Jews, this is the anti-Hasmonean, that he didn't realize that successes against one's kinsmen is the greatest misfortune, and supposing that he was erecting trophies over his enemies rather than over members of his own people. On the other hand, the Hasmoneans, this Hasmonean advocate, didn't practice what he preached. So in this civil war, there were real issues: fighting on the Shabbat, priesthood, God's will, how it's revealed, kingship, and yes, the relationship between Judaism and dominant culture. But these ideological differences got lost in the violence and the triumphalist narratives of First and Second Maccabees. So the history of the Hasmonean rebellion is really a complex tale of a society at war with itself. And my last and main point is that the books of the Maccabees are typical of severely partisan accounts emerging from civil wars in different times. First, as I pointed out, the subtleties and details of the actual doctrinal differences among Jewish groups opposed to the Hasmoneans are lost because they're not reported. Why should they be reported? There's a lot we'd like to know about the Hasidim, and other groups maybe not even mentioned. But First and Second Maccabees are single-minded Hasmonean documents emerging from an internal struggle. In a civil war, you're either really in a civil war, which is one of the most extreme historical situations you can be in. In civil war, you typically for us or against us. The subtle distinctions in doctrine are not important. In fact, they even distract from the main purpose, which is to win at all costs. That is, First and Second Maccabees are accounts written by the winners, not only of a successful rebellion against the foreign empire, but in a multi-sided internal war as well. As a result, there are, in the Hasmonean review, winners and losers, enemies and friends, patriots and traitors, pious and impious, holy and unholy, just as in any civil war. The books of the Maccabees were written to justify the victory, to explain it, to disseminate it, to be celebrated, to simplify it, and also to erase some parts of it, such as that there was conflict within Jewish population about the Hasmoneans' beliefs and methods. The complexities of the reality are hidden behind the binary presentation of enemies and friends, patriots and traitors, and is hidden in language typically used by factions in all civil wars. For example, both books describe Jewish enemies as wicked people, as transgressors of the law, as slaves to evil doing. I've just pulled out some epithets from there: children of insolence, men of arrogance, wicked, and so forth. And here's an interesting one. It's written that Yehuda Maccabee fights Israel's war. In other words, Jews are now divided between Israel and not Israel. They're called turncoats, haters of their own nation, lawless men, and so forth. These are classic indications of civil war mentality, when your brother becomes your enemy, and the most vile, alienating language is used to dismiss their validity or legitimacy. Now, I've long been interested actually in Greek historical descriptions of civil war, since a study that I made a long time ago of the Greek historian Thucydides, who offers a brilliant theoretical model of civil war. His main idea there is that, and by the way, the author of Second Maccabees quotes Thucydides in describing their side of the civil war. Thucydides' main idea in his understanding of civil war, stasis in ancient Greek, is that stasis is a state of mind. It's a psychological state, which sometimes is expressed by armed conflict, but is basically a state of mind that persists. And this state of mind, according to Thucydides, is first reflected in distortions in the use of language. A language which enables you to describe murdering fellow Jews, for example, as bravery, or labeling Jews who disagree with you as traitors. The fortune of First, Second Maccabees is that they are the only narrative that survive. In fact, in First Maccabees, it's written specifically, explicitly, there's no other narrative of Yehuda Maccabee but this one. And I'm quoting now, there's no written record of other details of the history of Yehuda, his battles and his heroic deeds and personal greatness. This is what there is. History is written by the victors. Now, I'm not saying here that I think that forbidding Brit Milah and reversing it or tearing up Torah scrolls, replacing temple worship with pagan rituals is a legitimate point of view. I'm just saying that the whole conflict was much more than binary and more complex and subtle than our main sources allow. And I leave you with the question, merely how would the narrative have been written by other Jews of the time? How would the Hasidim have written the story? How would the sect of Qumran have written the narrative of Hanukkah? How would a Jewish peasant in a Judean village watching everything unfold have written it? How would a high priestly family who lost the struggle with Hasmoneans have written the story, and so forth? It all depends on who's writing the history and what terms they choose to use and whom they identify as the enemies, and the good guys and the bad guys. So seeing that the time has almost run out, I'll leave you with that question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Price. That was fascinating and thought-provoking. I see there are no questions in the chat. I'll quickly allow you to unmute yourselves if anyone has questions, and if not, we will continue. Okay, any questions from the crowd? You can unmute yourselves now and ask. All right, thank you once again, Professor Price, fascinating. Okay, we are moving on to our third lecture of the session. Now, just as in the Hasmoneans had a treaty with Rome, the modern city of Modi'in Maccabim Reut has a partnership with the Friuli Venezia Giulia region of Italy. And as one of their partners, they requested a lecture about an issue which we think about a lot in regards to Modi'in, as in my place, as in the Antiquities Authority, and the municipality itself is thinking about this issue constantly, which is the subject of restoration of heritage sites in a developing city. So I will broadcast a pre-recorded lecture of Professor Giovanni Lavara, a professor of architecture and an architect, about that issue from his point of view. All right, so once again, as it is a pre-recorded, I would, and we're broadcasting a video, it would help if anyone who wouldn't bother them too much to stop your video, and I will broadcast just a second.